Hot take, The Lord of the Rings is one of the most important stories ever written. Okay, maybe I slightly exaggerated the temperature of that take, but we're going to talk a little bit today about The Lord of the Rings and my personal history with it. I'm going to throw my hat in there and talk about why it's so great and so important. Let me paint you a picture real quick, alright? 6-year-old me, overactive imagination, hyper as hell, just needing the right stimulant at the right time to become completely obsessed and annoy the hell out of everyone around me. Enter Peter Jackson, who made some banging stimulant 3 years in a row, and you have the recipe for the me you currently see sitting in front of you. I've watched the Lord of the Rings trilogy probably like 15 to 20 times over the years. I've read the books 3 times, and I have become absolutely obsessed with the fantasy genre. And there's a lot of talk nowadays about how Lord of the Rings hasn't aged that well in this way or that way. I mean, part of the reason Game of Thrones became such a cultural phenomena is because it was marketed as, this ain't your dad's fantasy, this ain't no cheesy Lord of the Rings with elves and dwarves and all that other nonsense. Don't get me wrong, I love A Song of Ice and Fire and Lord of the Rings for their own reasons. I don't think you have to put one down to love the other, but I don't think you can deny that that is part of the marketing appeal of Game of Thrones when it was coming out. I do think there's some merit in criticizing The Lord of the Rings and how it maybe has or hasn't aged. I mean, no matter how much of a genius you are in your time, as time goes on, certain things will change, sensibilities will change, and your work, which is stationary in time, will never match that forever. We can appreciate it and also acknowledge that. But this is not a negative Lord of the Rings video, this is a positive one. We're going to talk about something that's actually aged really well about the series, something that arguably hits harder now than it did when the books were written. As you could tell by the title, it's about Frodo and Sam. To this day, Frodo and Sam's relationship is probably the best depiction of like an honest, emotionally available, and genuinely affectionate friendship between two men, or hobbits, that I've ever seen. It's genuinely fantastic, but the reason I say it's actually aged so well specifically is because of how our political landscape has evolved since Tolkien wrote these books. I don't think Tolkien necessarily wrote this relationship with the intention of defying any particular gender norms. Now, I'm not an expert on what things were like in the 40s and earlier, but I feel like in the West, at least, it was more common for men to be more like outwardly affectionate in certain specific ways that maybe it's not common anymore. Not that men were super liberated back in the day or anything like that. I'm not trying to front. I'm very happy to live in 2021 instead of 1940, whatever the fuck, okay? What he did intend was to write a relationship that depicted all of the traits that I mentioned earlier. But because of that, as a consequence of that, it's also become something that defies gender norms. And let me explain what I mean, because some people are probably a little confused right now. See, when I was a kid and I was a huge Lord of the Rings fan, I used to hear people talk mad shit about Frodo and Sam, talking about how they're gay, which was kind of whack for a couple of reasons. Reason number one, obviously that's pretty homophobic, the idea that Frodo and Sam are like gay and therefore Lord of the Rings is gay and therefore we don't like it, because usually when you heard this criticism, it was in a negative context. It's not like people were like, are Frodo and Sam gay? And then they engaged in like a critical discussion about the sexuality of these fictional characters. That I think I would be okay with, but I wasn't really on Tumblr, so I don't think I saw too much of that. What I saw was more of just like dudes seeing two guys like hugging and being like, don't go where I can't follow, and thinking, oh, these guys are fruity. Which leads me to reason number 2 why that was whack. It's kind of sad that people see something like this, something that is, like I said, just genuinely affectionate, and conclude that the only possible explanation is that they're gay, because there's no way 2 straight men, or hobbits, would act like this. I know I'm not the only one who thinks that's extremely sad and extremely limiting to men and their ability to express themselves around friends. Even as a kid, before I really understood sexuality and stuff, I really resented that, because these 2 characters were like my own friends. These 2 characters were characters that I went on this journey with over and over and over again, and didn't get tired of it because I connected with them and I related with them. And because of this toxic narrative that I also kept hearing growing up, it also ended up representing something completely different. It represented liberation from this restrictive gender norm. And looking back on it now, almost 20 years later, number one, holy shit, I can't believe it's been almost 20 years. I do not feel like it's been almost 20 years, man. Like 20 years ago, I definitely thought present day me would have his shit way more together than I currently do. But also looking back on it, I feel like my repeated exposure to their friendship, their genuine honesty and availability to one another, the fact that they had no qualms about showing physical affection as well, like all of these things had a real positive impact on me. And I don't know if that would have been the case for people who read Lord of the Rings when it was first released, at least in the West, or even in the modern day in places outside the Anglosphere, because everything I'm saying here is very much specific to like North American gender norms. Like if you go to South Asia, which hi, I've been there a handful of times, as you might be able to tell, dudes are holding hands and shit. And you know it's not because they're like openly gay, because, you know. But from my perspective growing up, this definitely represented an emotional openness between two men that I wasn't exposed to in my actual day-to-day life very often. So thank you to J.R.R. Tolkien, Peter Jackson, and everyone else involved with The Lord of the Rings. So moral of the story, people can shit on Lord of the Rings for being overly simplistic or whatever other thing that they don't like about it. But also, please give Tolkien his props, because in addition to grandfathering basically the entire modern fantasy genre, he also had a much better grasp of character than people give him credit for, and his stories had a huge impact on me specifically, and I'm sure on a lot of other people like me, in ways that you might not expect, in addition to all the ways that you probably do expect, like becoming obsessed with fantasy. So that's about it for me today. This is a pretty low-key video in comparison with some of the stuff I've recently been putting out, but I don't know, this is just vibing this way today. If you've watched a few of my videos, first of all, thank you. Second, well, let me know how you feel about this more like laid-back style of video, because I'm gonna be honest, setting up a whole ass green screen and editing all that is a lot of work. But I hope you're having a good one. Watch Lord of the Rings or read the books if you haven't, please. And I'll see you next time.